Hey everyone, and welcome to another tutorial by artandcontext.org, where we explore various art-related topics. My name's Matt, and in today's tutorial we will be covering the topic of watercolor techniques. Now, watercolor is a really versatile medium. However, sometimes it can be really difficult to know where to start or how to use this medium. So in today's tutorial, what we'll do is we'll go through a few different ways of how to utilize watercolor in order to create some unique effects, some images, seeing how we can kind of maximize the medium in order to create some interesting images and ultimately give us a sense of how to utilize the versatile nature of this medium. So with that being said, let's get started. Now, what we want to do is we first want to divide our page into 8 equal segments. In this tutorial, we'll be going through 8 unique techniques that we can use with watercolor. So what we want to do is we first want to make sure that we have 8 equal sections on our page, and in each of these sections we're going to explore different techniques and images and see how to use this medium in interesting and unique ways. So with that being said, we're going to take a look at the first one. Now, what we're going to do with the first one is we're going to create some clouds. Now, clouds are really versatile. They can be used in landscapes, they can be used in all sorts of different artwork ideas, and this particular way on how to create clouds with watercolor is really interesting, because most often when you think about creating clouds, what you're thinking of is painting in these wide structures. However, in this case, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we have some tissue paper nearby or some toilet paper, and what we're going to do is we're going to use that toilet paper or tissue paper and create some negative spaces that will ultimately give off the appearance of a cloud. So what we want to do first is we first want to kind of prime our first section of paper just with some water, and this is where we want to create a nice little thin coat of water over the paper. What this is going to do is, as we apply some color to the paper, it's going to create an even dispersion throughout the entire segment of paper. Now, once we have applied this thin coat of water, we can move on to working in some blue paints. Now, what we want to do is, as we work in our blue paint, we want to make sure that we work in even strokes from side to side, moving from the top of the section of the page all the way down to the bottom section of the page. And this is where we want to make sure that we are having these even strokes moving back and forth all the way throughout the entire segment on the page. Doing so, making sure these strokes are even, is going to create this more seamless transition between the color gradient, and this is why we prime the paper with a thin coat of water beforehand. So as we proceed to apply the blue paints, what we're going to do is we're going to make these even strokes moving from the top of the segment all the way down to the bottom of the segment. We can also darken our blue if we want, depending on how dark you would want the sky to look. Obviously, you can play around with transitioning in colors. This is really useful when you want to create something like a sunset. However, in this case, to keep it simple, working with a simple blue, making sure you have that thin coat of water laid over the paper, and then applying the blue paint is going to create that seamless transition throughout the entire segment. Now, while the ink is still wet, this is where we want to start working fast, and what we want to do is we basically want to work with some tissue paper, and this is where we're going to start making some blotches into the wet ink with our tissue paper. Now, that's going to result in these negative spaces throughout the entire blue section. Obviously, you don't necessarily need to do too many. You want to be quite strategic in terms of how many you make, making sure that you don't necessarily overpower the entire blue section of paper, but you do want to make sure that you are strategically incorporating these blotches with your tissue paper. But yeah, it's as simple as that. This is a basic way on how you can make clouds using watercolor and a simple tool like tissue paper, something that's really available most often, and it's pretty realistic in terms of creating these more distant like clouds due to the textured quality of the tissue paper working into the wet soluble nature of the watercolor paint. It creates these really soft edges, so it kind of achieves a more realistic cloud shape and effect. So it's a great technique and a great tool to use in your own watercolor paintings. Now we're going to transition into the next segment of the page, and this is where we're going to work on a more layering effect. So this is going to be a little bit more abstract, but it's going to give us an understanding of what happens when we create layers upon layers upon layers and what kind of effect this achieves. Now this part, we're going to start again with this thin coating of water layered over our segments in the page. And then from there, what we're going to do is we're going to proceed to add in some paint. Now, this is where we can play around with integrating different colors. As we create that single water layer over the page, what it's going to do again is it's going to allow these colors to seamlessly integrate and ultimately create these more softer and seamless gradients throughout the paint. So the intention here is to again make sure that you create this thin layer of water over the page, and then you can start incorporating different colors of paint. You can start working them in from the edges. You can be a little bit playful in terms of what colors go where. You can darken the edges, you can lighten the edges. At this point, it's really up to you. That being said, the intention with this process is to first create this kind of seamless integration of different colors of paint. Again, making sure you establish that base layer of water so these different paints or different colors of paints can kind of seamlessly integrate into each other. You can also play around with adding in dodges of colors in different areas. Make sure that you play around with adding all sorts of colors. The intention again is to make sure that we're incorporating colors for this first layer whilst the paint is still wet. So remember, when we're working with watercolor and we're wanting to create these more seamless integrations of color, we really want to work fast. Watercolor is definitely in some cases a time dependent medium, so this means we want to work fast sometimes when the paint is still wet, making sure that we can create these more seamless integrations of various colors in that kind of quick application process. Now, once we have finished and completed applying different colors of paint to this wet paint layer, we want it to dry completely. Again, something to think about is normally when watercolor dries, it's going to look slightly different to that of when it was wet. So the idea here again is to kind of create layers and see what happens when we build up dry layers onto previously dried up wet layers. And what I mean by this is when we've worked with a more wet application of paint and making sure that these paints kind of merge seamlessly together, it creates a layer, and then on top of that we're going to work in some more dry paint marks as a more drawing style application. So the idea here is to see how we can create this more watery color integrated effect as a base layer, and then on top of it we can work in some dry paint marks to see how it creates this unique layering effect. Now, once our base layer has dried completely, we should be left with something slightly different to that of which we started with. So again, the dried effect is always going to look slightly different to that of the wet paint during the application process. Now, the idea here is to again be a little bit playful in terms of how we integrate some new marks in order to create this layering effect. Now, the reason why we want to learn this quality as well is this is really useful in terms of creating depth in paintings. And as you apply different marks on top of these layers, you can create all sorts of things. So for instance, this can be a great way to create a backdrop for more dry applications on top, which can create this quality of distance in the painting, which is really useful for landscapes or simply bringing out something in the foreground and creating a more blurred effect in the background. So for instance, in this case, applying maybe something like a bunch of white spots is a great way to create this effect of a flower bed or lily pad field. And again, this is another just useful way to think about using watercolor in terms of creating layers to achieve the quality of depth within your own artworks. Now, this is a bit more of an abstract and a more general idea of how to utilize watercolor or how to use a specific watercolor technique to achieve something interesting. But now, that being said, we're going to transition on to the next one, where we look at something very specific and kind of utilize within the watercolor genre very often. This particular technique can be used in all sorts of ways. It can be used to create gradients within skies, create depth within landscapes, and this is where we learn how to create a simple gradient shift that is seamless and transitions without any distinct lines. Now, we've kind of used this process for the cloud drawing, but in this case we'll look at it a little bit more specific in terms of how to create a distinct color difference or shift that seamlessly changes throughout the segments within the page. Now, what we want to do again is this is where we're going to prime our page with a layer of water. And as we do this, it's really important for us to make sure that that coating of water is evenly spread throughout the entire page. So the idea is to not have any dry spots, and to make sure that it is a thin layer of water coated over the entire section of the page. From there, what we can do is we can use any color. It's really up to you, but the idea here is to kind of create a dark to light shift. So the way in which we do this is, what we want to do is we want to take some paint, load our brushes with some paint, and then from the top of the segment, what we do is we make these even strokes back and forth, moving all the way down from the top of the segments in the page to the bottom of the segments in the page. Now the intention here is to make sure that the water is covering the entire surface area of that segment in the page. This way we don't have any dry spots or blotches that's going to affect the application of paint. Now what we want to do is we want to load our brushes with a color. That color is up to you, and the idea is to now, as the page is still wet, we want to be quite quick with this application process and simply apply some paint moving from the top of the segment in the page all the way to the bottom of the segment. Now the trick here is to always start from the top moving down, and as you do that, what you're doing slowly is kind of darkening the top section of the page, or the segment in the page, and kind of as you work your way down with your brush to the bottom section of that segment in the page, the application of paint becomes lighter. So every time you reload your brush and you start again from the top moving downward, what you're doing is you're creating this gradient shift from the top to the bottom of the segment in the page. And in doing so, what you are creating is this gradient shift from dark to light, transitioning seamlessly between one another within the segment of the page. Now again, the idea is to do this while the page is still wet, and making sure that every time you load your brush with paint, you are starting at the top and simply working your brush from side to side, completely moving throughout the entire segment, all the way from the top to the bottom of the segments in the page. Now in doing so, again, you're making sure that you're doing this while the paint is still wet, while the paper is still wet, and after you have completed this process, you want it to dry completely together, and ultimately drying as this seamless gradient within the segment of the page. Now this kind of idea of creating these gradient shifts, I mean, again, can be used for all sorts of things. It can be used for creating skies, it can be used for creating distinctions between ground and sky. It's a good way to create backgrounds in order to draw things on top of, to create this quality of depth. There's many ways to use a gradient shift. By learning how to create a gradient shift in an effective way, where you can see that the paint is seamlessly changing and transitioning from dark to light, is an essential skill to have within your watercolor repertoire for your own watercolor artworks. Now that being said, what we're going to do is we're going to transition into something a little bit more interesting, where we kind of use a combination of some of the things we learned in order to create a very specific type of image. And this is where we're going to learn how to paint a galaxy. Now galaxies are super fun to paint with watercolor, and that is because painting a galaxy or something abstract like a galaxy is actually quite simple, and also really useful, again, for all sorts of artwork ideas. Galaxies also just work really well with the watercolor medium because the nature of galaxy cloud clusters and color transitions are quite seamless. So in order to achieve those shifts in gradients and make it quite seamless, can be done really well with the medium of watercolor. We will also find that creating the illusion of star formations by the incorporation of splattered paint is another way to create this effective and realistic representation of a galaxy through the use of some simple tools and techniques, and some other mediums that can be used in tandem with watercolor. So that being said, let's get started. Now, starting in another segment in your page, what we want to do is we want to start priming our paper again with some water, and this is where we're going to create these seamless transitions between colors. However, in this specific painting, what we want to do is we want to leave a little bit of negative space in the center, and this is going to function as a main cloud cluster or kind of Milky Way effect that runs through the center of our galaxy painting. Now the idea is to kind of build up layers from light to dark, and what we want to do is we want to work from the edges in towards the center of the page, towards that negative space. So what we want to do is we want to kind of build up the colors that are going to peer through these darker colors that we'll layer on top. So the idea is to kind of build maybe some blues to purples and eventually some blacks, and every time we apply some paint we want to make sure we're working from the corners and shifting towards the center of the page. Now again, this is a process where we want to be quite swift with our watercolor application. The idea is to kind of create a seamless transition between these colors, and the way in which we do this is again by incorporating paint whilst the paint or the other layers of paint are still wet. Now the thing about galaxies is that also they're very unique in terms of aesthetic, color combination, so it's really up to you in terms of how you want to color your galaxy painting. That being said, it might be interesting and worthwhile to stick to some more conventional colors, which is a good way to see how to create a more canonical idea of a galaxy sky, and seeing how to build up these lighter layers and eventually work over them with some darker layers. And this is where we start to see how we can also transition into colors. So for instance, we can work with lighter blues, then darker blues, then kind of shift into deep purples, and eventually from the edges work in some black, and see how these merge into one another to create this kind of seamless transition between dark edges and then a lighter central area where that light blue first layer starts to peer through a little bit. Now the idea is to build up these layers also whilst the paint is still wet. Again, this is going to have the most effective and seamless transition in color shifts. So we want to bear that in mind as we apply our paint and be a little bit swift with this process. So in terms of creating a galaxy backdrop where we're going to apply some white splatter paint on top of, we want to be quite swift with that first process of developing those layers of color while the surface of the paper is still wet with paint. Now once we have completed that, we should have allowed the paint to completely dry, and once the paint has completely dried, we should be left with a unique combination of purples and blues and maybe blacks around the edges. Again, it's completely up to you in terms of how you'd like to color your galaxy and create these color transitions, but once we have done that, what we want to do is we're going to now work with some white acrylic paint. Again, this is kind of a combination of how to use another medium in tandem with watercolor, and this is a great way to understand that watercolor can be used with other mediums. So in this particular scenario, what we want to do is we want to use something like a toothbrush. You can use a paintbrush, but a toothbrush is going to be really effective, and the idea here is that we're going to use some white paint on the surface of the bristles of our toothbrush, and then slide our finger along the toothbrush to create these splatters of little white paint drops, which ultimately in combination is going to create this starry effect within our galaxy painting. Now again, this is a really fun way to create something really unique like a galaxy sky, and there's so many different color combinations you can pursue. You can also pursue different color combinations in terms of stars, where you can use a combination of yellows and whites to create a variation in star color, but it is something to think about in terms of how you'd like to change the color and overall aesthetic of your own galaxy painting. Now this is a very specific idea of how to create something very unique by the utilization of both acrylic paint and watercolor paint. However, when you are applying the acrylic paint with your toothbrush or your paintbrush, something to bear in mind is that you don't want to load your toothbrush with too much white acrylic paint. In doing so, you might end up with these very large blobs of white paint, which can obviously affect your galaxy painting in a negative way. So make sure you just keep that in mind and maybe be a little bit more light on the acrylic paint, have a more thin coat of acrylic paint on your thumb or on your toothbrush as you make these flicking marks. And ultimately, yeah, you can play around with how clustered or how dense you would like your stars to be within your galaxy painting, but this is a fun and beautiful way to create a galaxy by the utilization of watercolor. learning how to use these layering effects in a way that can create something a little bit more specific, and ultimately how to create an artwork by the combination of both watercolor and acrylic paint. Now, the next painting we're going to move on to is something where we're going to utilize this technique called wet on dry, and this is basically where we create wet painterly marks on a dried backdrop. Again, this is very specifically used to create qualities of depth within a painting, and this is specifically useful when you use the technique of creating seamless transitions, where you have wet the entire paper to create this gradient shift from bottom to top or top to bottom, to create this distinction between the ground and the sky. Now, we're going to kind of proceed in a similar way that we have for most of these paintings, where we kind of coat the page with some water first and make sure it's evenly coated with water, and then from there what we want to do is we want to use some green to establish this gradient shift. Now, we're going to do the same thing that we did for our previous gradient shift painting, where we start to paint from one side, applying more darker applications of paint from the bottom, and then move our way up and allowing the paint to get a little bit more faint and lighter as we move our way through to the top of the segments of the paper. However, this time our application process of paint is going to be from the bottom of the page moving to the top of the page. Now, we want to be quite fast with keeping the paper wet and applying paint to the wet paper, and in doing so what we're going to do is we're going to create that transition of green moving from the bottom to the top, making sure that the bottom is slightly darker, and then slowly transitioning into a lighter top area within the segments of the paper. Now, something more specific here in terms of creating an actual landscape where we establish a horizon line, what we're going to do is we're going to actually create these tree-like shapes with some darker green ink while the paper is still wet near the top of the segments of the page. Now, in this particular painting, the idea is to create these tree-like shapes with some darker green ink, creating this horizon line near the top of the page, or top of the segment of the page, and this is going to create this kind of foresty effect in the background once the page has dried. The idea here is to kind of work in a horizontal line with some green ink, and then create these strokes of vertical lines that are in the shape of a tree. Obviously what we want to do is we want to work in these little vertical lines along, or starting from that horizontal line and moving in an upward direction. And this is where we create a variety of different tree shapes, so we can play around with how tall or how short we want some trees to be, but the idea is to keep it quite vague and just generically in the shape of a tree. The idea is also that once this has dried, it's going to appear as if there are some trees in the background, so we don't need to worry too much about making them look too realistic, because once that has dried, or once these trees have dried, what we will do is we'll actually paint an actual tree on top of this dried layer, and that's going to create this depth effect between a actual tree in the foreground and then the combination of trees in the background. Now, once this green painting has dried, we should be left with this seamless transition from dark to light, moving from the bottom of the page to the top of the page, as well as this generic and suggested idea of trees in the background by the incorporation of some darker ink when your page was wet. It should have dried with these darker marks that kind of define or suggest trees in the background to be quite faint, and that's what we want. This is why we want to work in those marks before the page dries, so that as the page dries together, those trees in the background become a little bit more faded and kind of fall into the background or merge into the background. Now, once this has dried completely, what we're going to do is we're going to actually draw a tree on top of this painting, and it's going to create this layered effect with a tree in the foreground and a forest kind of in the background or merged into the background. Now, this is where we can be playful with how we paint our tree, with what kind of tree we want to paint. In this case, I'm painting a simple pine tree, and I'm starting with a simple brown vertical line that runs directly through the entire segment of the page. Now, allowing the a tree to run through the entire page is also creating this idea of a tree in close-up, making it seem that the tree is quite close and therefore kind of moving through the frame of the painting. At this point, it's really up to you in terms of how you'd like to paint your tree. You can create all different types of tree shapes. You can create a variety of different branches, have more, have less. You can make your tree quite dense with leaves, or you can give it a more autumny effect where there's only some leaves visible. But the idea of this painting or this watercolor technique is demonstrating how the quality of creating a backdrop using some of these techniques you've learned prior, such as creating these seamless transitions and gradients, can be an effective way to create a backdrop for a landscape where we establish the difference between a ground that's moving into the background, and then ultimately adding some wet painterly marks on top of that to create something in the foreground. So this is a really effective way of using that gradient shift technique where you create that backdrop and then being a little bit more playful and drawing based with your painterly marks to create something a bit more specific and distinct in the foreground. Now we're going to move on to something a little bit more interesting and a little bit more technical, but still incorporating and utilizing some of the techniques we have used before. In this case, what we will be painting is water. Now this is something really fun to paint. Again, water is also a very abstract looking element, so the structure of water kind of shifts and changes in scale and size, and in this particular painting what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to paint water from the foreground into the background using some of the techniques we have prior. So again, what we want to do is we want to simply coat the entire segment of the page with a thin coat of water, making sure we don't leave any dry spots. However, this time we're going to be a little bit more strategic with how we apply our paint. Now, when we think about water and waves, generally they're moving in this kind of horizontal direction, so there's very few vertical lines defined within the structure of water when we see it, and that is because water kind of moves on this horizontal plane. So what we want to do is similar to how we created these gradient shifts from dark to light, we're going to do the same thing, except this time we're going to be a bit more strategic with our negative space. So the idea here is that we're going to again not only create these layers and let it dry and then add layers and let it dry and so on and so on, but we also don't necessarily want to paint the entire page as we move from one side to the other. So starting with some really dark blue ink, the idea is to kind of work in these horizontal lines, starting from the bottom and then moving all the way to the top. Now the intention is to actually layer blues on top of one another, starting with some lighter layers of blue and then ultimately working in some darker layers of blue. And what we want to do is we want to first make these horizontal strokes and layers while the paint is still wet, and then we're going to let it dry and then add in some highlights throughout the entire water painting to just give it a little bit more three-dimensionality, some depth and a little bit more structure. So while the paint is still wet, the idea is to create these horizontal strokes, but what you want to do is you want to leave some negative spaces in between some of your strokes. So what you want to do is you want to kind of start again from the bottom and shifting all the way to the top, because this is going to create that quality and illusion of depth, making the water seem as if it's moving into the distance. Now something also really specific and important for making the painting look more realistic is we want to think about the size of our strokes. So naturally, if something's moving into the distance, it's going to appear slightly smaller, and this is how we want to engage our application process in terms of how thick and how thin we make our strokes. So as we continue with these horizontal actions, we can make our strokes quite large near the bottom of the segment in the page, kind of giving the appearance of bigger and larger waves in the foreground, and then we can make those strokes slightly thinner and smaller and smaller and smaller and more faint as we move into the background. The idea is again to build up some light to dark layers with your paint while the paint is still wet, and this is going to just be a layer that we will paint on top of once it has dried. Now don't be too generous with your application of paint. Again, we want to be very strategic with how we leave some negative spaces, because this is ultimately going to create those moments of highlight and shadow within the structure of the water. Now again, the idea is to build up these layers while the paint is still wet, but we don't necessarily want to fill the entire page with this seamless transition and gradient of blue. We do want to make sure that we have established a light layer with horizontal strokes leaving some negative space, and then on top of that a darker layer of blue with horizontal strokes and leaving some negative space. So every time we apply our paint and create a transition from dark to light, moving from the bottom of the paper to the top of the paper, we always want to make sure we work it in horizontal strokes and leaving some negative space each time. Now we're going to allow that to dry, and once it has dried, we should be left with this kind of blotchy horizontal effect of blues that transition from dark to light as it moves up to the paper. And now this is where we're going to use that process of applying wet to dry, where we start to paint on top of this with a little bit more defined and drawing styled marks with our paintbrush. So we're going to follow the exact same method. However, this time what we want to do is we want to work with some darker blues, and this is where we can start being a little bit more strategic in terms of defining the gradient shift or size difference in horizontal strokes that move from the bottom of the page, which is obviously going to be the foreground, and slowly shifting towards the top of the page as the strokes get smaller, which will define the background. Again, as we create these strokes, we're doing the same thing by kind of being a little bit subtle and a little bit sparing with our mark making process. We don't necessarily want to overpower the entire application of paint that's in the foreground that we have done before. But what we do want to do is we want to kind of work from the bottom, moving our way to the top. We do this for two reasons. For one, the paint is going to be quite dark on our brush as we load it, and this is where we can make the painterly marks at the bottom of the segments in the paper a little bit darker and thicker, giving the appearance of it seeming quite close to the foreground. And then we can slowly make those horizontal strokes with our paint, which will not only get more faint but will become smaller as we shift our way to the top of the paper, which will define the background of our water painting. And this is the general process of how you create a water painting. So you first want to establish that seamless gradient shift with some horizontal marks while the paper is still wet, where you're kind of using that knowledge of creating marks on a evenly wet surface, and that's going to create a more seamless integration of these different colors. From there you can let that dry, and then we can use the wet on dry effect, where we can now start to paint a little bit more distinct marks on top of that, creating more refined lines to define the structure of the waves that kind of shift from the foreground into the background. Now, once we have painted these darker horizontal marks on top of our dried background, we will allow it to dry, and then we'll proceed to add in some more layers. And we'll find that every time we add these darker layers on top of a previously dried layer, the previously dried layer dries slightly lighter to that of when it was wet, and this is just the nature of watercolor. So what we can do now is, once that layer has dried completely, we can proceed to add in darker horizontal marks again, making sure our strokes move from the bottom all the way to the top and become lighter and smaller as we move along towards the top of the page, giving that idea or illusion or effect of water in the foreground and fading into the distance. And this is the general idea of how to create water. Often you'll find that actually with these more abstract landscapes and images such as galaxies or clouds, or even water, the watercolor medium lends itself really well to effectively achieving the quality of these different images and landscapes. So once you understand these various watercolor techniques, there's a lot of ways you can use it in order to create very unique landscapes, and also using these different techniques in tandem with one another to build up layers and ultimately create qualities of depth and qualities of texture, and so on and so on. Now, the next painting we're going to move on to is something a little bit more common within the watercolor medium, and that is this bleeding effect. However, this bleeding effect oftentimes is a result of an accident, but when used strategically, it can be a great way to create very unique structures. And in this case, what we'll learn how to paint is a flower or a set of flowers. So this particular bleeding effect is a really good way to create this quality of petals. So it's been used a lot within flower painting, within the watercolor medium. And this is where you start to pay attention to the very specific gap between a wet and dry surface. And in doing so, what you'll find is that the ink will bleed and ultimately stop and create these very unique bleeding effects on the paper. So what we want to do is we again going to start by priming our paper with some water, making sure we have an even coating of water laid over the entire paper. And then what we can do is create a gradient to establish a background for our flower painting. Now, what we want to do is we want to work with a distinct color on our background. So if you make your background something similar to mine, like yellow, maybe consider using something like a red, or just think about what color combination would work really well. Now, the idea here is to create these blotches, and as you create these blotches, you will see that the blotches will bleed out. However, the very specific skill here is to kind of pay attention to the drying of the paper. So you want the paper to be damp, and when the paper is damp, what's going to happen is as you make these blotches, they're going to bleed out, but eventually they will stop because the paper surrounding the blotches are dry. Now, this is going to result in this dispersed quality within these blotches, and they can be really beautiful and useful in terms of creating unique flower effects. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to create these blotches on some damp paper and then allow that to dry a little bit. Now, this is where we're going to start incorporating some darker blotches, smaller darker blotches within our previously made blotches, and this is going to establish the floret or the disc floret, which is the center of the flower. Now, there are many ways in which you can paint flowers, but this is just a more abstract, a little bit more fine art way of developing flowers in a way that's a little bit unique to the watercolor medium. So once your blotches have dried, you can continue to create smaller blotches within those previously made blotches, and this is going to start developing a flower. And this process you can actually continue obviously to create all sorts of different flower shapes and disc florets, but in this case we'll just make another set of blotches in our previously made blotches. Now, as we continue with this, we're gonna then proceed to work again with the wet on dry approach, where we start working in some more painterly, more drawing style paint marks, where we can actually start defining the quality of these flowers. And now, the reason why the watercolor medium works really well with this layering effect is because when you work on a wet surface, it creates these very soft and subtle backdrops on which you can paint and create more distinct line work or a little bit more refined structures with a drawing approach. And this is really good in this case when you want to make something like flowers. So once we have established those blotches effects and we allow it to bleed out, we create these very unique petal looking dispersions by the incorporation of these blotches layered on top of one another, and then from there we can start working in some drawing marks to define petal shape and flower shape a little bit more distinctly. This is where you can obviously now start to be a little bit more playful with your color choice. If you want to kind of stick to the same color theme like I am in this particular tutorial, you can work red over red, creating this distinction between dark and lighter reds, and that softer red in the background kind of just serves as an undertone or an under base layer to emphasize the darker red that we paint on top. And this is just another way to utilize that combination of softer, wet, seamless gradients within watercolor, and then kind of layering other painterly marks on top. Again, watercolor does really well to create layers, and it's a medium to really emphasize that quality of building up layers within your artwork. So it's something to take advantage of and something to understand in depth. And in this particular tutorial, we have covered a few ways of how to use this and how it can create these very interesting landscapes and structures such as water and trees and galaxies and flowers and so on. Now you can obviously continue with your flower drawing until you have created unique flower combinations, working in petals, and that's where it's up to you and how free and how playful you want to be in terms of creating a variety of flowers, in terms of also how you create features on the flowers and so on. And then for the last painting, we're going to move on to something a little bit more strange, and this is something very specific to the watercolor medium, and this is how we create a more abstract looking quality within our painting by the use of salt. So there are many ways to achieve different types of textures and effects within watercolor. We've seen how to use splatter paint, how to use tissue paper, but salt is a very useful tool in terms of creating something a little bit more strange and unique. And it's a great way to kind of create these crack-like effects that could be used as a desert, or it could be used simply within an abstract painting. So the idea here is, once again, we're going to prime our paper with some water, where we create this thin layer of water coated along the entire surface of the paper, and then we're going to start by integrating a color and creating a gradient if we like. At this point, it doesn't necessarily matter, but we do want to just make sure that we again are working a little bit more swiftly and working whilst the paint is still wet. So again, this is one of those processes where we work while the paint is still wet. But the idea is to coat the entire paper or surface that you are painting on with some water, and then you want to apply some paint, making sure it's evenly dispersed throughout the entire paper. And then whilst that paint is still wet, what we're going to do is we're going to proceed to sprinkle on some salt, spreading it out through the entire paper, and then we're going to leave it to dry. And the idea here is that the salt is basically going to create these little marks and effects in the paint while it's wet, and then ultimately leaving a very unique combination of negative spaces. And then once it has dried completely, we can remove that salt, and then we have this very unique abstract looking painting quality that can be used as a backdrop or used simply as an abstract painting itself. So just make sure you have a wet base layer, make sure you apply paint, make sure you sprinkle salt along the entire surface area, wait for it to dry, and then take it off and see what you have, and you should have a very unique and interesting looking result. But otherwise, guys, that is it. I hope you have learned a few interesting things throughout this watercolor techniques tutorial. You have learned how to not only use different techniques, but how to apply them into something a little bit more specific, like various landscape ideas, how to paint flowers, but also looking at some of these techniques in isolation and understanding them in their most simplistic form, like how to create gradients on a wet surface. If you like this tutorial, please give it a like and a subscribe. We really love exploring the watercolor medium, so we'd like to do more. If you're interested in more watercolor related tutorials, please let us know in the comments below. Otherwise, guys, that's it from me. Until next time, cheers.